couldn't have imagined anything like that you could kind of just make up your own scenario.
Hello and welcome to Where the Living Room Used to Be, a podcast about Rhode Island's music scene.
Hey everyone, it's James. For this episode, I met up with Keith Munslow at his home in Providence. We talked about how he went from art school dropout to being on the board of one of the longest running art spaces in the country. We also discussed his time touring with Big Nazo, his children's music, the process of writing Benny's the Musical, and how he's been a self-employed musician for over 30 years. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the episode, please tell a friend. And as always, follow along on Facebook and Instagram at LivingRoomUTB for show flyers and photos from Keith's time in music.
I wanted to do two things when I was a kid: play the drums and draw. And those were the only things I cared about. Like, you know, I would bang on the piano, but that was like about it. And
like, how old were you then? Like, do you remember when that fascination with drums and drawing started?
6, 7, 8. And then I started studying. Drums is the only instrument I studied. Like, I started taking drum lessons at school when I was in 4th grade. And did it. Like, but it was very much like of that. Like, here's a snare drum, and we're gonna very traditional, like, rudiments and everything. Like, I didn't touch a drum kit till I was in high school. It was like all band stuff. Yeah. And then when I was 12, my brother went off to Berkeley, and he all of a sudden, he was pursuing, like, they were teaching him a lot of theory. And so at this point, like, I can read, like, snare drum music, orchestral percussion music. Like, that's all I can read, like, kind of at that point. And so my brother started finding himself in need of somebody to, it was just at a time where you couldn't just go on YouTube and find a track of somebody playing a 12-bar blues for you to practice to. Yeah. So there wasn't a lot. There were some things like Jamie Abersol records and tapes and stuff that you could play along with, but there wasn't a lot. And so he would conscript me because he was older and bossier, and he would show me, like, a thing on the piano to play, like a phrase or a pattern, and just say, just play it, so that he could practice improvising.
Yeah, okay.
And then, he's much more of a natural teacher, and so then he would, like, just for fun, he would show me, like, here's a blues scale, and, like, sort of my payment for being his background musician was he'd teach me, like, a thing on the piano. So but it was mostly just goofing around. But, here's a C blues scale, here's an F blues scale, here's, and then eventually I started knowing what these chords were. I didn't really understand the theory behind them at first. But it did get me interested in the piano, and more specifically, it became a vehicle for, like, I know, like, 6 chords. I can make up a stupid song with a bunch of my friends, like, as a goof.
I got you.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so piano started to become, like, this vehicle for writing songs.
Okay.
Which you obviously can't do on the drums. But my brother was probably between school, like, learning about music in school, and then my brother in the house, like, sort of actively studying it.
Yeah.
It was, like, of interest, but for me, it was, like, I liked to play music, but I was way more into the social aspect of it, of, like, hanging out with a bunch of my friends and making up, again, like, mostly in the early days anyway, less comedic, like, stupid things that we thought were funny and would make us laugh.
Yeah, okay.
So it was a lot of that.
Were there comedy records that you were listening to?
Oh my God, yeah. Like, a lot of that. We have family in England, and when I was, like, I think it was 11 or 12, maybe younger, my parents, my cousins in England sent us an LP of Monty Python, which was not yet on television here.
Oh, okay.
So we didn't know what the hell it was. Like, we didn't know it. And so it's just recordings of the sketches straight off from TV.
Yeah.
But there's no visual context, and it's all super absurd. And some of it is really very like referential, like making pop culture references or political culture of Britain references. So we didn't get it, but I was like in deep, and I just played it to death and memorized it. And then when I was in junior high, like talked my English teacher in 8th grade to let me and a bunch of my friends like basically perform like covers of these Monty Python sketches in the library for the whole 8th grade. Like we just learned them and did them in bad British accents, the junior high school in West Warwick.
Was that your first performance?
Yeah, it was certainly the first thing like that I organized, you know what I mean? Like, and it wasn't a music show. And then, but I did it a couple of times. I had this very cool English teacher who just, we went to him and like, can we do this? And he was like, yeah. And like devoted class time to it and brought all the other 8th grades and 9th grades in. And yeah, we did it a couple times. The first time we did it they were all covers of Python sketches. And then the second time we did it, we wrote like a play, like a comedic, like heavily lifted from Young Frankenstein, like about, we made a monster and we accidentally put Slim Whitman's brain in his head and like, and like, but he let us do it. Like we did this 1-act play. So yeah, it's funny. I never really thought about it, but that was certainly the first couple of shows that I like produced. And then by the time I get to high school, then we were like putting an actual high school band together.
Yeah. What was that band?
A rock band. So that band had the dubious name Gossamer Wing, which if any of my fellow bandmates here, they'll be like, don't you scorn that name. But it was like, we were playing, we actually were writing some originals too. We had a fair amount of originals. At that point, like those folks who I met in band,
in high school band?
In high school band, like, like concert and marching band. They introduced me to, they were all kind of heavily into the Beatles, which was not something I'd ever gotten into. And they were much more, into like, so this is the 80s, but they're like deeply into 60s music.
Okay.
And then stuff like Jethro Tull and, other things that they were listening to. And so in that band, I ended up being put on keyboards, which was really insane because I really didn't know how to play, and I didn't own a keyboard, and so I would always, whenever we played, I would have to like borrow stuff. I would eventually bought like this piece of garbage like Vox Continental at a flea market, and then I would stack other keyboards on it, and then when we played dances at the high school, I just wheel the grand piano out of the auditorium into the cafeteria and play that on songs, and so. But at that band, I ended up playing keyboards again because it was a thing where like I wanted to write songs. So even though I didn't know a lot, I knew enough to kind of play rock and roll. And and I knew enough blues from my brother to be able to solo on rock and roll. Like he taught me enough about improvising, And then I studied it a bit in high school. I took like jazz improv and a few classes. But again, what was comical and remains comical to me is that I wasn't reading. Like nobody cared that I couldn't read piano music. Like the high school jazz band teacher put me in as the piano player in my senior year, and I was like, I don't know how to read piano music. And he's like, well, can you read chord symbols? And I was like, some of them, so I knew what chords were, and I knew mostly how to make them. I knew like the basic stuff, and then learned along the way. So he and or my brother, I would get like these piano music sheets for these songs in jazz band, and they would turn them into chord charts.
Oh, okay.
And so to this day, that's how I communicate musically, is like chord charts.
Yeah.
Because it was not a thing that I thought was it was something I enjoyed, but I still had it in my head in high school, like, go to art school, become an illustrator, and then play music as a thing that you like, not as a thing that is a hobby. Yeah, that was always kind of the idea, and so all the while I'm kind of also pursuing visual art, like trying to like make that a thing. Okay. So,
did you play out with this band?
Yeah, we played. Yeah, we did. We played a lot of high school dances.
Yeah.
The Sadie Hawkins dance and a lot of that stuff, and then we also played. We got ourselves roped into a bunch of Battle of the Bands that we did, and then we would play like the drummer's dad runs like a sportsman's club in West Warwick, so we got gigs where we could get them.
Okay.
but we were deadly serious about it. Like, we took ourselves super seriously. And it was like a crazy configuration of a band. Because again, a bunch of friends. Like, so it was like, we had 3 guys, all of whom played guitar, none of whom were really a bass player. So they would just take turns playing bass on songs. We had a drummer, we had me, and then we had 2 girls who both sang and played the flute. So we were doing like this like moody blues stuff, and like, we're covered for flute. Yeah. And, so it was a little, it was an insane configuration for a band, but we were popular at the school, and for me in high school, it was like between that band and just being a wise ass, like that's what saved me from bullies in school. Like, it was like, oh, you're in that band. Like, okay, we'll leave you alone.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a thing, it was like, it was definitely a thing, like in junior high, like, super nerd got picked on, and like, but high school was like, that became a way to.
Yeah. No, I had the same experience where it's like, hey, I heard your band doesn't suck.
Exactly. And that's
you're all right. Your band doesn't
right.
suck. Yeah. And then they wanted to buy weed off me.
Yes, of course.
Band or something. I was like, I don't.
Of course. I do that. Now you suck again.
Did you play any Rhode Island venues with that band, or what was the?
No. Like, I mean, I think we played like the Covered Wagon or something. Like, we would play like these, like, we'd restaurant things here and there, but we didn't play any clubs with that band. I didn't really start playing in clubs till that band broke up in my senior year, and then after that, me and one of the guitar players in that band started writing songs, and then we kind of roped my brother in to also play with us, and then
what was that band?
So that band was eventually called New and Improved, and so it was me and my brother Joe Auger, and then we had various people come through playing bass. So Stan and Joe played guitar, and then we had bass players.
Yeah.
And so that, right around that time, so I went off to art school after high school, and to this college that no longer exists that was in New Bedford called the Swain School of Design. I got into RISD, but couldn't afford to go, and like didn't have enough scholarship money or Pell Grants to afford RISD at that time. So I went to this other school, and it was in New Bedford, and I hated it. Mostly I hated living in New Bedford. And really? And I think at that time, I think I got very disillusioned, and it was probably just being a freshman and just being in an unfamiliar place. But it was the whole vibe of art school to me and this particular group of people. It seemed incredibly pretentious to me. And like when I would go to parties and people would talk about art, like it just people were taking themselves far too seriously. So my only friend consequently at that school was a musician also, was a drummer. And so he and I became buddies. And then, so I dropped out of school after 3 semesters because I just couldn't take living there. And, my mother and father were like, okay, well, then you're going to have to work. And so, I just got a job at Sears and changing tires and, and then meanwhile putting this band together with my brother and my other friend. And so right around that time, I got a call from my high school art teacher who found out, and she had been pushing me very aggressively towards, you're going to be an illustrator, go be an illustrator, go draw greeting cards for Paramount. And she was very, very pushy. And so she called me. I was still living with my parents. So she calls me to, she knows I've dropped out of art school. She's pissed off about that. And she has met Bert Krenke, who was an artist who was running a class. She didn't say much about what the class was. She said, he's teaching this class at the Ben Weiss Gallery in Providence, and I want you and Auger. So Joe Auger was the other guy that I was in this, one of the other people I was in this band with, and who was also, did some visual art. And she was like, I want you to go take this class, bring your portfolio, and insisted that we go.
Okay. So
we went and we met this guy, and Bert was a very charismatic guy, and he was a painter. And so he was teaching this class, and it was like, well, what is this class? And he would have us do drawing and stuff. But then eventually it was like, just bring in projects you want to work on, and I'll kind of guide you.
Oh, okay.
I didn't really know he was very charismatic. And so he's in the Ben Weiss Gallery.
And where was that?
On Charles Street.
Okay.
On Charles Street. And so me and Joe would stay after this class. It was like half a dozen of us. And there was a piano in the gallery, so we would kind of jam, and Bert would play the bongo, the congas, and Joe would play the guitar. We would just jam and sit around and talk. And so I was like, I'm asking him questions. I've never really met like a person who's like an artist for a job.
Yeah.
And I'm like, like, where do you live? And he's like, oh, I live here. I'm like, this is a gallery. He's like, yeah, well, there's like a little apartment in the gallery, and the guy who owns it, I curate the shows, and he lets me live here, and he lets me eat in the restaurant that he also owns next door every once in a while. And like it blew my mind, because I think I just, it was very blue collar family, and I couldn't have imagined anything like that you could kind of just make up your own scenario.
Yeah.
It wasn't a traditional job at all. He was basically curating for an apartment. And it was like, what? And so, Joe and I have this band, and we're taking classes from this guy.
And roughly what year was this?
This would have been 84. Because AS220, I think, launched in 85.
Yeah, okay.
So it was either early 85 or late 84. But what Joe and I didn't know was that Bert was looking to kind of recruit people, because he and some of his other friends were already in the process of devising AS220. They were all visual artists, and they were tired, and some of them did really edgy stuff, and they were tired of the jurying process that galleries use. So they were like, we want to make a place. They sent a manifesto to the Providence Eagle, which was like one of the arts papers in Providence at the time, and they said, we want to, basically, art shouldn't be juried. And so they launched AS220 on the third floor of PPAC in 1985, and they were already, they were shrewd, like, Bert Krenka, Susan Clausen, Peter Boyle, Scott Siebold, a bunch of these artists. They knew, like, they were all like in their 30s, maybe some of them were older. And they were like, it can't just be us, like, because there's no sustainability to that. So Bert was kind of like looking into the community, like, we need some young creative people to like populate this place. Yeah. So that was part of what this class was, and it's why I don't want to assume what Bert was thinking, but I think it was why the class was so kind of loosey goosey. And so then the next thing I know, like AS220, we're opening this thing, and he called it like a coffee house and a gallery. Like, again, I was 19. Like, I didn't know what unjuried, uncensored. I didn't know the ramifications of that. I didn't really know, like, politically what they were about. I just we're opening a coffee house, and like, and it's a gallery, and you can, so then he's like, can your band play like the first show? So we're like, yeah, sure. So we played the first show at AS220 ever with that band, New and Improved. And it was, there were, 30 people there, and like, and then it was a thing. But because I was living in West Warwick, like, I wasn't at AS220 all the time at that point. And so we would just, again, this band, we're taking ourselves very seriously. I'm working a day job, but we're like, all we do is rehearse. And we play some gigs in Providence. The Cage, which was in the Jewelry District, I don't remember exactly where, but the Cage was a club we played. Definitely played a few shows at the Living Room when they were on Promenade.
Yeah.
We played at Rocket, and then we played a lot of shows at AS220. But then very shortly after being in the space in PPAC, AS220 got kicked out of PPAC, and then they opened up their space on Richmond Street, where they remained for, I don't know, it was half a dozen years they were there.
Yeah.
And so when they moved over there, that's when I became really involved in AS220. Again, because it was like socially, like, it felt like my tribe, whereas like going, like, the people at art school, I was like, no, like, there was, and it was probably just, they're like youth, it was all these 18-year-old kids, but all the artists that were hanging out at AS220 were older than me. And I thought they were super hip, and, they just had it was scruffy, and they appreciated the talents that I had. Like, they liked that I could play music, and I could play the piano, I could play the drums, I could draw. Like, they were into it.
Yeah.
And so I started doing stuff there. Like, I would play with my band, or I would get involved in these cabarets that they had every week. And then I eventually got roped into the sort of in-house performance art troupe there called Meatballs Fluxus. And that was like, again, me and Joe Auger got pulled into that, and we were, certainly the youngest guys in the group. And
Yeah.
and it was very like challenging performance art stuff that had a musical component, like crazy stuff. And one of the things I really liked about it was we would get together on a Thursday and people would bring their ideas and would kind of put it together, and then we'd perform it on Saturday. It was very quick.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it was like, but it was like what I liked about it, because I was a creative kid, like anything you showed up with, they were like, yeah, let's, there was, so I came in one week and I was like, well, I want to have a jam with all of us where all of your noisemakers or instruments have to fit in a cigar box. Like you can't have anything bigger than fits in a cigar box. And they were like, oh. So everybody like showed up, with cigar boxes, like with, kalimbas and kazoos and like and we all got on stage and like put our faces in the box and like played these little things and sat around in a circle.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it was, so for me, that was like a magical thing that I could just show up with a really crazy idea like that, and then we could just do it, and that seemed magical to me. So I'm still like at this point kind of like living at home and working a day job and then doing this crazy stuff, still playing in a band. Like I had already had my fingers in a lot of pies. And one of the shows I did at AS220 with my band, which now had morphed into this a trio. Joe Auger started playing bass because we just had too many crazy bass players, and it got winnowed down to a power trio that we called Curio. And it was a really good band. Like it was like certainly the best drumming I've ever done in my life.
After 10, forgot to set the clock again. It's happening again. I'm off for work, a total mess. Forgot to shower, shave, and dress. It's happening.
And so the guy who started Big Nazo, Arminio Pinque, he had just graduated from RISD. He was kind of starting this like puppet and mask company, and he ironically took over the space in PPAC that AS220 had been in.
Oh, really?
And PPAC was fine with that because there were no punk bands playing, and like the stuff AS220 was doing was too much for them. But so Arminio had the studio there, and he saw me play with Curio. He saw me playing drums.
Yeah.
And he got my number from Bert, and he called me up and he was like, hey, I'm doing this gig, And I didn't really know what he was about, and he encouraged me to come over to the studio. And I went to his studio, and I was blown away by the puppets. And one of the reasons I was blown away by it was because to me, I showed him my sketchbook. I was like, these look like drawings that I've been doing for my whole life, like very caricature-esque and big noses and exaggerated features. So I connected with the puppets right away.
Yeah.
I knew nothing about him. I knew nothing about what he was trying to do. But he was like, we're going to do a show, and I think it was at a school or something. I don't remember. But he's like, I want you to play drums in the show. And I was like, okay. And then at some point before the show happened, he called me and was like, the keyboard player can't do the show. Like, I heard you play keyboards too. I was like, kinda. And, I wasn't really playing a lot. I didn't own any keyboards. I'd shifted my focus over back to drums. And he's like, well, the guy has a keyboard and you can just use it. And
But the beginning of Big Nazo, had the idea of having this band, or was
he right away he was had three components really. He did gigs where we would kind of do strolling around things in character, which also really appealed to me. And then shows at schools, which were like a 4-person show with just me on music. And then he always had a band, and the band was in there early on playing rhythm and blues and cool music, but I was like, at this point he had all these guys who were like had been playing with blues musicians and were really good. And and I didn't know anything about, I knew enough to kind of get by.
Yeah.
And he kind of just threw me in with these guys, and they were nice, but I felt way, way, way out of my depths, and was doing it and got this real education. Like, they were all really cool guys, and they would, see what I was trying to do, and the drummer would be like, "Have you ever listened to Professor Longhair?" I'm like, "I don't know who that is." He's like, "You should, you're a drummer?" I was like, "Yeah." He was like, "You play piano like a drummer," and I was like, I didn't know what they were talking about. They were like, just go to Chips Moldy Oldies and buy Professor Longhair records and go home and listen to them. And I just, they were all older than me. I was like, what, and so there was this real thing that was going on at that time where all the artists at AS220, most of whom were older than me. I had some peers there too, my age, but there was a lot of people older than me. And then a lot of the guys in the band in Big Nazo were also older than me, or at least more experienced than me.
Okay.
And so they were like, go listen to this. And I would get these records and be like, oh my God, this is... So listening to Professor Longhair blew my mind apart, because he really was playing piano like it was a drum. It was a very Caribbean kind of influence and percussive. And that's what hooked me into that music.
And what else did you do with Big Nazo? How long were you playing with them?
I played with Big Nazo for almost 10 years. Maybe it was 10. I joined in 88. So I'd gotten a job. So this is a substantial moment to it. I think it's worth mentioning. I'd gotten a job as what was a paste-up artist, which is not a job that exists anymore. It was right before computers took over graphic design. So everything was done by hand. Type was printed out on photographic paper and then cut up with an X-Acto knife and then laid out on a gridded board, and you'd wax the stuff and stick it down. So menus and flyers and posters and stuff. So there were the designers who worked at there's a place called Wolf Lithograph down near the airport. And they would design these posters. They would print out all the type. They would show me this is what the thing looks like. And then I would cut it apart with an X-Acto knife and paste it up. So that was a paste up art. So to me, it was an entry-level graphic design job.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, I got a job in art. Okay, cool. And I had that job for about 2 months. And Erminio from Big Nazo said, we're going on this tour in Canada. It's the sort of anchor of the tour. It was really just going to Halifax for a couple of weeks to do this Buskers Festival. And it was we're going to perform as many shows as we can fit in a day. And people will, throw money in the hat. We'll split all the money. So there's no guarantee of anything. It did turn out that we made piles of money doing it, but I didn't know that. And so all I knew was a 2 or 3 week thing where I was had to go do this tour. And I was well, I can't do that because I have this job and I only just got it.
Yeah.
So I go home. He actually called me at my job and talked to me about this. And then I come home and I'm having dinner with my parents. And I'm obviously I'm sort of freaking out. And my parents are what's the matter with you, man? And so I was this guy from Big Nazo asked me to go on this tour, and it's to Canada, and it's for this. I tell them all about the tour, and I was but I'm working at Wolf Lithograph, and I'm doing paste up, and so I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, and my parents look at each other, and again, this is my parents who never had money, and but my dad looks at my mom, and they're my father goes what do you mean you don't know what to do? Go on the tour, and I was what? And they were oh yeah, who knows if you'll ever get a chance to do this again? You can always get another job. Quit your job. And I was it was absolutely not what I thought they were going to say.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was a moment. It was a defining moment because they were so what? So I went into work the next day and I quit my job.
Yeah.
And I went on that tour, and that job, that was the last regular job I ever had.
Wow.
That was it. It was and that wasn't, I didn't know that was going to happen.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just how it turned out. So I went on that tour, and I've been self-employed ever since.
Mm-hmm.
So I was 23.
Wow.
And so I went on that tour, and again, I met people on that tour. They were street performers, but these were not like casual street performers. These are like lifers, like pirates, and they again, some of the coolest people I'd ever met. I'd never met anybody like this, but they shared this thing that Bert Krinka also had, and all the artists at AS220 had, which was that they were making up their own way.
Yeah.
You know, some of these people didn't, and this is not a life I imagine for myself, but it was still something where I was like, wow, like some of them had no permanent residence. Like they just would go where the weather was and go from festival to festival, from city to city, all over the world, and travel and just make cash money, and were off the grid.
Yeah.
And again, like I didn't want to be that, but there was an element of that I was like, I like that. I like that they're mavericks, not playing by the rules, you know, and they're just following their thing and going. And so that really had a profound impact on me, that festival, like immensely. So between AS220 and like going now, so now I'm like in Big Nazo, and it's the only source of revenue that I have. And it's not enough to live, but I get it. I move in with a roommate in Providence, and you know, and I start living in Providence, and it's like enough. I'm getting by.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and Big Nazo now is like, we're playing all over the place. Like it gets busy, and you know, and he doesn't tour a ton, but he tours, and we're going to cool places, and you know, around the country, and then eventually out of the country.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that was it.
Were you playing in other bands while you were with Nazo?
So yes, not at first, but for a while it was just Big Nazo. But then through AS220, through this cabaret, Bert had this character that he used to do called Sir Guy de Guy the Portugee, and he would host this cabaret of the Oddly Normal, and he had a band that he called. There were so many like things that I'm now like, wow, like I think about. You can't really like judge their appropriate or inappropriateness, but I think about it as like, man. So he had his like sort of house band was called His Panic Band, like his Sir Guy de Guy the Portugee and His Panic Band. So that was like a thing that my friend Chris Adams, who's also a piano player, was doing a lot, and then I ended up doing it when Chris couldn't do it, and then I don't really remember exactly how this happened, but like. Me and a few friends, my Rick Massimo, Paige Van Antwerp, Alec Redfern, ended up being like these characters of like New Orleans musicians. So I would do this character called Kingfish Lear, and Kingfish Lear spoke in this undecipherable like New Orleans dialect, like so you couldn't understand anything he was saying except like every fourth word. It would just be this deep. It was like sort of modeled on Dr. John, and like. But it was way in like, I see ground up compound, taking a weasel home and a pickup truck and blah, blah, blah. It was just gibberish. It was gibberish with a New Orleans accent. And so we would play for the cabaret like as this band. And so every Saturday I would write a song and we would do it. And it was like this barrel house, like really ragged blues. Like Paige just played a snare drum and Rick played bass and Alec played accordion. I played the upright piano in AS220. And so we did that for a long time, and eventually we reached this point where we were like, we have a lot of songs. We should do another show. You know, and so I told Bert, and he was really upset about it at first, and like people are always taking things out of AS220, like and he got really mad. And but we did it anyway, and even though it pissed him off, we changed the name of the band to the Smoking Jackets, and we played a show at Cafe Zog. For tips. And Bert came to the show, and a bunch of our friends came to the show, and after the show Bert was like, all right, I was wrong. Like he was like, you guys should just play gigs. So we continued to play for him as the Smoking Jackets for a while, but then the Smoking Jackets started getting gigs, and again this was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm listening to as much blues as I can, like jump blues and like backcountry blues, and like these. You know, I honestly would go into Chips or into Tom's Tracks, and I would like just go through records and like look for records with pictures of like old guys playing beat up pianos, and be like, maybe this, like I had there's no internet to like know,
Yeah.
or so the guys in Big Nazo would tell me, oh, go listen to Champion Jack Dupree, go listen to Roosevelt Sykes. They would tell me about these guys, and I would go find them. And then, so I was just learning it off records, just learning how to play that music. I was way, way, way in. And it was a really fun form to write lyrics to. It was really simple.
Okay.
And it was really, there was I don't want to say all of it was comedic, but there was like a nudge, nudge, wink, wink to a lot of the music, and that appealed to me too. So I would just write about stupid stuff in my life and my cat and, whatever it was. And so I was doing that at the same time that I was in Big Nazo. And then I also got roped into, shortly after that, I got roped into the Neo-90s Dance Band, which was another AS220 project. That was an enormous funk band. And the only criteria to be in the band, this is true, for many years, the only criteria was, can you make a Sunday morning at 9 a.m. rehearsal? If you can be there at Sunday at 9 a.m., you can be in the band. That's the criteria. So that means the band could potentially have 50 people in it. And it went through phases of size. I think it was as big as 14 or 15 guys at some point, just a giant horn section and percussion. And,
wow.
And that was not a style of music I was familiar with either. A little bit, but I didn't.
Who was writing the songs in that?
Me, Chris Adams, who was the trombone player and also a keyboard player. Tom Paulus, who has since passed, who was one of the singers. There was a guy named Tom Hurdle who was could kind of play a saxophone, but he would show up with these very minimalist, very funny lyrics, and would set them in music. So eventually it became me, because the thing about a funk band is the only thing you need to start the engine is a riff.
Yeah.
You just need a riff. So I would go I got this riff, and they'd be like, yeah, that's a good riff. And then it would go. So it was a lot of group writing.
Yeah.
Chris Adams, for my money, Chris Adams was the best songwriter in the band, and he really knew how to write that stuff, and he was deeply immersed in bands like War and greasy, funky stuff that was just so cool.
Yeah.
And that band played every last Saturday of the month at AS220, and it would be packed and just sweaty, crazy dancing insanity.
Yeah.
And that went on for many years, and it continued when they moved into the new building on Empire Street for a few years. And then a lot of the people moved away, some people got sick, and the band changed personnel, and eventually it just got to the point where it was really hard to keep it going. But in its heyday, in the early days of the band, we played the Ocean Mist, and we played a lot of shows at Lupo's and the Met and G Flags and the Campus Club, and the band, nobody ever made any money because there were too many people, but we played a lot of shows, and it was great fun, great bunch of guys and girls. There was a lot of overlap. Rick Massimo played bass in both of those bands.
Yeah.
He played in the Smoking Jackets, he played in the Neo-90s. He didn't play in Big Nazo, but there was some of the guys in Big Nazo. The sax player in Neo-90s was also in Big Nazo, and he was eventually in Smoking Jackets. There's a lot of incestuous kind of we're let's do another project, let's do another project, let's do another project. Yeah. And I had a lot of time, and I was living very close to the bone, and just, but it was this incredible immersion, because at a certain point I was in the Meatballs, Fluxus, the Neo-90s Dance Band, Big Nazo, Smoking Jackets, all at the same time. And it was just insane. I got to this point where I was I need to do a different thing. I got to do a different thing. I'm not spending time. I had a studio at AS220 I wasn't working at, because now I had internet at home. And so I would just do all my songwriting at home, and the board of directors meetings fell out of my depth. So I met up with Bert for a coffee, and I was I need a new way to plug in, man. I want to stay plugged into this space, but I feel disconnected. He was like, oh, I'll think about it. I was I know it's not your job, but just, and I sort of imagined, because at this point I had been doing music and stories for kids for a few years. So this is in 2005. So I started doing stuff for kids in like 97, 98. But I'll back up to that. But I imagined that what he was going to say to me, AS220 was just launching a youth program. Like, oh, maybe he'll get me into like teach youth workshops or whatever.
Yeah.
So he called me back a few hours later and he was like, how do you feel about running like a cabaret or like, you know, a variety show here like we used to do with the Pork Chop Lounge and the Cabaret de Alino? I was like, oh, that sounds cool. And he was like, we can pay you to do it for a year. You run it and we'll pay you. And you curate it, even though AS220 is open and unjuried, the show will be curated. You pick what's in it.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. So I kind of sat at home in my apartment on Whipple Street and I typed up like, okay, I want to pick the musicians. I want to have a house band, pick the musicians. I want to have a house sketch comedy / performance art troupe, and I want to pick the guests. So I learned a lot watching the Pork Chop Lounge, and I learned a lot being in the Cabaret of the Oddly Normal about what kind of stuff works and how shows flow. And so I called him back and was like, all right, here's my pitch. I emailed it to you, and like, I don't want to do it every week. That's too much. I want to be able to have some time to refine the material, like once a month, first Sunday of the month, and we'll call it the Empire Revue. And then that was that. And that show is now, we just turned 13 in July. So 13 years of that. And it has gone through a lot of changes of people who were involved in the show, in the comedy troupe. But it's in an amazing place now. And I learned how to direct a show and run a show. Like I really did. It was from all of that experience in Big Nazo being directed, and in Meatballs Fluxus, like creating stuff from scratch. You know, so all of that stuff is in there. Even though, and the Python that I listened to, like it's all in the sketches that we do in the review. All of that stuff I got an incredible education from a lot of really talented people.
Yeah.
So.
And I know you work with Wage House and Pawtucket as well.
Yes.
Can you talk about the musical improv?
Yeah. So that was a thing that came. I started doing some work. Like I learned like improv from being in Big Nazo, which was not to say I learned about improv as a way it's performed, but I learned. I was improvising characters and crazy stuff my whole life, but Big Nazo was like an immersion in like character improv, because so many of the gigs we did, like we would stroll around at festivals for 3 hours just in character, so, and a lot of the shows were built through improv.
Yeah.
So then I started like taking, little workshops in it, and I started learning games. So then I started like doing it with kids as workshops, but then I became, friends with some of the guys with the people in Improv Jones through my ex-wife, who was my then girlfriend, so she said we should do like a musical improv in Jones, and I saw them do an improvised musical with another piano player, and it was like, oh, okay, I can like hang with that. They would just basically do like scenes into songs, and I would just make up the songs. I was like, I know enough about music to like, and it was really exciting. So I did a few of those with Jones for a few years, and then I started, dabbling with other stuff. And then again, while I was married to my ex, I got involved with the Providence Improv Guild and did more musical improv there. And I started kind of refining how I viewed it, and how I thought it could, again, having seen no one else do it, just like, I think it should be this and this and this and this and this. But then I would start to see other, we eventually got into the New York City Musical Improv Fest, and I would see how other groups did it, and like, oh, they're using like song forms, and like that appealed less to me. I was like, you shouldn't like predetermine what the form of the song is going to be, like, because who knows what you need. It's more like, let's get everybody an understanding of how songs are shaped, and then let's create that shape based on what we need, because maybe you need a song that's 20 seconds long, and if you have a song form, now you're married to this verse, chorus, you can't get out of it if it sucks. Yeah. So I never liked that. So I try to like figure out how to teach it. And I ended up teaching it at the Improv Guild with Jimmy Sorrell, who's a really talented improviser and is now a member of the Empire Revue. And then I eventually, I got divorced, and so I stopped working at the Improv Guild, largely for personal reasons. But I kept teaching musical improv there for a little while. But then Wage House opened, and it was a way for me to bring it somewhere else that wasn't a loaded emotional space for me. And so I started working at Wage House, and they were really great, and they really welcomed me, and because it was a curriculum that I had basically kind of built up from scratch, it was like, I would just do it there. And so that's another kind of great relationship, because a lot of the folks involved with Wage House are members of the Empire Revue too, and it's continuing in this tradition of like a lot of cross-pollination that happens.
Yeah.
And a lot of the sketch we write from the Revue, not a lot of it, but some of it is built through improv, and everybody's conversant in comedic songwriting, and so whether we're improvising them or writing them for the Revue, it's all in the same wheelhouse.
Yeah.
And it's all coming out of that place. So that's something that I really, really improvised music, like doing improvised musicals, is like definitely a thing. That between that and the Revue, those are the gigs that I do that I call them mental health gigs, because they're just like, it's like soul food for me.
Really?
Like it's the people that I get to work with are just some of the kindest, coolest, most talented people I've ever had the pleasure to work with. They're just an amazing group of people, and it's an incredible amount of fun. And one of the goals early on, when I a few years ago, I dug up that little outline of what I thought the Empire Revue should be at Centibert, and I was like, it's still, that's what it is. It's still that. Like, it's gone through a lot of personnel changes and stuff, but it's still kind of that same vision. And one of the things I wrote in that list was like, I want to make a thing that builds the community of artists I'm making it with, but also is something that embraces the community at large. That we wanted to make it feel like the people who come to that show feel like they should feel like they own it, like that it's theirs, and that is the thing that is really special about the Revue, that I think everybody who's involved in the show is deeply invested in. And that got proven true when Benny's closed, and we decided after many years we were not going to play Super Bowl Sunday because we just got tired of begging people to come to that show. So we would play a show on the first Sunday of December, and then we would do a New Year's Eve show. And then we said, okay, we're not doing, technically we have all of January off. We're not doing a show on the first Sunday of February. So now we have 2 months, whereas normally we have 1 month to write the show. So that felt like a huge gift the first year we did it in 2017, early 2017. And right around that time that we decided we were going to do that, Benny's announced that it was closing. So I said to the stage manager, Nikki Mariani, who's co-produces the show with me and is a dear friend, like maybe we should do a musical, because we'd kind of dabbled with that form in the show. Maybe we should write a musical. We have 2 months. And she texted me. She was like, Benny's a Requiem ? Like, too sad. And then I was like, it's a little sad. But then we started talking to people, and like people were so kind of up in arms about it closing. But then you also started hearing like, oh my God, like there were way more of these stores than I thought there were, and they're all going to close, and all these people are going to lose jobs. And so we got together, and it was like, there's a story there. There's a story. Like, we shouldn't try and tell a history of Benny's, and nor should we try to tell we shouldn't presuppose to know why they're closing and any of that stuff. We should just tell the story of who this affects, which is the people in the community and the people with those jobs. So we wrote that show. And again, we wrote this thing, and Nikki very casually sent out a press release about it, and the Journal printed it the next day. And then normally, we've sold out some of the Empire Revues over the years, but, normally we got to promote the shows a lot to get a good house. And, cause when you run a thing for 13 years, you got to keep reminding people that it exists.
Yeah.
You got to keep doing that work. So we talked to the people in the cast, and they're like, is everybody on board to do this? And people are, yes, we are on board to do it. Okay. By the time we got together to brainstorm the show did not exist. It had sold out at AS220. It was we were just doing it on the first Sunday, like we always did. So it sold, and we were like, oh, all right. So, so we felt the weight of that.
Yeah.
And we worked really hard on the show. And so we talked to AS220, like, can we add another show? They were like, do the next Sunday. So we did the next Sunday, and that sold out. And then we were like, should we do it again? So then we like asked the Columbus about doing it up in their upstairs, which was like twice the size capacity wise of AS220, like 250 seats. So we booked a weekend at the Columbus, and that sold out. And so there was this thing where it was like one of the members of the cast said something that was really profound, and it speaks a lot to the kind of work that I like to do in the Empire Revue, and also the work that I do with kids. He said, so a lot of the people who came to see the show were obviously people who were from the community who love Benny's, like all of us.
And the show is Benny's the Musical.
Benny's the Musical, yeah, sorry. Benny's the Musical, which was, more in the form of a Broadway musical.
Yeah.
But we group wrote it. We wrote it all as a group. And so, but there were also a lot of employees of Benny's that would come. Like there were whole groups of people who worked at particular Benny's who came to the show, like 10 or 12 of them, and they had their shirts on and their badges, like,
oh wow,
just showed up, like drove from Massachusetts and like,
yeah,
heard about it and came, and we'd look out at the audience, like when we were playing the closing song, and they would just be in tears, and people were like so effusive in, it wasn't like praise, like they loved the show, but it was so important to them as part of a way to grieve this thing that everybody loved, and so we were, it was exactly what we wanted to happen, but like we couldn't have like asked for it to turn out better. And one of the cast members, Stuart Wilson, said, it's incredibly rare that you get to perform a piece of work for the very people who need to hear it and see it.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. Like, so, it like the meaning of all of it was like, whoa, like, so we just finished, we're about to release, we recorded the soundtrack because so many people asked us for it. So we just were like, okay. So we like went in the studio and like,
really?
Cool. We recorded all the songs, and many of the people in the cast, they're all comedic actors. I'd say about half of them would call themselves singers, and the other half would be like, I don't know how to sing. And like, some of them, it was the first time they'd ever been in a recording studio.
Yeah. Where did you do that?
We did it with George Dussault at Galilee Productions in Cumberland, and it's where I record my kids' stuff, and an amazing engineer and musician, amazing guy. And he was really patient with us because it was I'd done a ton of recording, but I never like, oh yeah, like this song, like 9 people sing on it.
Yeah,
like, it's a lot to keep track of, and a lot of, varying levels of confidence, and also a lot of moving parts in the songs, but the cast completely kicked ass, and the band kicked ass, and George kicked ass, and it was great. So we're about to release that, and I suspect, maybe we'll mount that show again, but cool. It was really a dream come true, because it was just, a moment where, and I don't even mean this in a fourth wall way, but there's always like a space between the performers and the audience. Yeah. There's always space there, and there's an otherness to it. And, we always are going in the review towards the direction of like cross those, like make the audience feel more ownership. But that show was like the moment where we just all felt like we were in the same room, just being part of a thing, as opposed to like, we're doing a show for you. You know what I mean? Like they were because they were really feeding, like their energy was really feeding the performances, and the emotion of it was charged, and it was really cool.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
It was really cool.
Rakes and shovels, paint and potting soil, nails and pails and sails on motor oil, lawnmowers and leaf blowers and inflatable pools, gas barbecues and Gorilla Glue rechargeable tools, frisbees and dish soap and 10 kinds of hemp rope and flower seeds galore. Oh yes, it's true. And sponges too. We have everything that matters right behind these automatic doors. Everything that matters. You will never want for more.
How did you get into writing children's music?
So I'll backtrack a little for that. So when I was involved heavily in the AS220 in the 90s, and one of the people in the Smoking Jackets, Paige Van Antwerp, had worked at a recording studio, had worked at Celebration Sound, and she had been involved in some sessions with Bill Harley. I had never met him. And she said, you got to meet Bill Harley, man. Like, you guys are, like, separated at birth. And I was like, really? And she was like, oh, my God, you're so alike. It's absurd. And I never met him. And I didn't really know what he was about or any of that. You know, again, all kind of pre-internet days. And I didn't have kids, so I had no reason to know a children's performer. But then I got a call at AS220 from a woman who worked in Bill's office. Like, she called me there because I didn't have a phone. I wasn't in my parents' house. Like, I didn't have any way to be reached. And she was like, you know, do you know who Bill Harley is? I was like, oh, yeah. And, you know, like, she's like, well, he's a keyboard player. He had a band at the time called the Troublemakers. And they you know, he did most of his shows solo, but he would play some shows with the band. Their keyboard player, who was Steve Snyder, who was a huge musician in Providence, very influential musician, you know, in the late 70s, early 80s. And he was going off to work in public radio. And can you play this show? Okay. You know, and I was like, what's the show? And so Bill, at this time, he's not anymore, but at the time, A&M Records had a children's wing of their label. Yeah. And he was on it. And so they would get him into these crazy big shows. And so there was this rainforest benefit that Sting was organizing at the Greek Theater in California. And so it was like Sting and Bobby McFerrin and Don Henley and Little Richard, like huge names. And then the Troublemakers are in this show too. And she was like, so the thing that really struck me was, you know, in this 5-minute phone conversation, she told me how much money I was getting paid. She she said, I'm going to put a tape of the songs you need to learn in the mail. There's a rehearsal on this date from this time to this time. And it was so like organized and that was, with all due respect to all the other things I was doing at that time, that was not the experience I had been having at that point. And it was so like super professional. And like, I was like, whoa. So this is like early 90s, maybe mid 90s, like 93, 94. And so I went and I met Bill and we clicked right away. And so I did that show and I started to see like, this was like a point at which I was like, I gotta find a way out of Big Nazo, not because it wasn't like I didn't like the work and I didn't like what we were doing, but I just wanted to do my own stuff. And I was burned out on the, just all of it, like not having control over it to some degree, but also like I needed to figure out how to make more money so I could just not be constantly worried that I was going to make my rent. Yeah. So I did that show with Bill and then I kind of got involved in his band and he and I became friends. And I was at this point where like I was still in Big Nazo and I wasn't making any money and I was really flat broke, like truly flat broke. And I did this thing with Bill. He was doing like a radio show in Newport and I did it for him. So it wasn't even a paid gig. And this is another watershed moment. We were driving home from this radio show in his van and I was like, this is it, man. I gotta like go get a regular job again. Like I don't have any money. Like I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent. I don't know how I'm going to eat. I got like $100 in my name. And he was really like, you can't, like something is going to break. Like you don't give up. And I was really mad at him because he was really successful at this point and he was making a lot of money. And I was like, that's easy for you to say, man. Like, you know, and I didn't say that, but I definitely felt it. You know, I was pissed off. I was just like, what? Something's going to break. Like, what are you talking about? And I swear to God, this is true. 4 days later, his wife calls me up and she's like, it's in the middle of the winter. I have no gigs. I don't have any money. It's bleak. And she's like, are you busy in January? I was like, no, I don't have any gigs at all. And she's like, I can give you like 20 shows right now. And I was like, what? You know, like she's like, Bill has 20 shows booked at schools, mostly at schools. Yeah. And he was at the Y this morning and he broke 2 of his fingers playing basketball. He can't play the guitar. And I was like, put him on the phone. And she puts him on the phone and I was like, you said something was going to break. I didn't think it was going to be your fingers. And I did those gigs with him, and we developed this really cool rapport in these shows because he was totally at my mercy.
Oh, okay.
You know,
also,
like
you still did the shows with Bill, or
yeah. So like he broke his finger. Like they needed me to play accompaniment because he couldn't play.
Yeah.
So and they were like, I don't know what they were paying me, but it was a lot of money to me. I think it was like $80 or $100 a show, and there were 20 of them. I was like, I was like, I'm going to make $2,000 this month. I've never made $2,000 as a musician. So we did all these shows, and then Bill and I kind of worked. This shtick evolved, because he couldn't play, and I would like refuse to play, and like and it was just hilarious. And our friendship really, like we were already friends, but it really bloomed in that point. And, and I got to talk to him a lot, and so he was like, I think you can do a thing. I think he always envisioned that I would put together some kind of comedy troupe like what I do with the Revue, but more for like schools and kids and stuff like that. But by the time that summer rolled around, it was still that winter, the guy who runs Perishable Theater, who ran it at the time, Mark Lerman, came into my studio at AS220 and he handed me this flyer, and it was from the Rhode Island Summer Reading Program, so the Office of Library Services. They're like, we're looking for performers to do the summer reading program. We'll give you, if you get selected, we'll give you a bunch of shows that you can do at libraries around the state for the summer. So I was like, no, it's interesting. And then half an hour later, the woman who ran Groundworks Dance Theater, which was also all in the same building, hands me the same flyer. She's like, this seems like you. Yeah. And like neither of them were going to do it because it wasn't enough money for a theater group to do. The shows are paying like, I think $110 for a show. So I was like, all right. And the audition was in like 2 weeks. So I sent in the little flyer and mailed it back, and they're like, great, come do a 10-minute audition. And I was, oh my God. So I wrote 10 minutes of material. Did not have a kids show. I wrote like a song. I was like, what am I going to put in this kids show? What am I doing now? At the time, like I was playing piano in Big Nazo and a million other bands. I was working with Bill, and I was freelance illustrating for the new paper. So I was doing illustrations for them too, for little tiny bits of money. Yeah. And food, restaurant trade, which was also very important. Yeah. And so I said, I'll make a kids show. I don't want it to be just like Bill, but so I pulled this storytelling component from working with him, which I really learned a lot from him, and from Mark Levitt working with him about how to write stories. And I wrote some songs, and I decided I was going to put drawing in the show because that was another thing I was doing. I was just going to put it all in one hopper and see what comes out. So I wrote 10 minutes. I don't even remember exactly what it was. I think it was a song where I would play the song for a while, and then I would like jump up from the piano and like draw a picture, and then they were like, okay, you got the gig. So that was in December or January, and then the show started in June. So I had 6 months to write a 1-hour show. So I wrote like a 15-minute story. I wrote a bunch of songs. I wrote some drawing shtick. Yeah. And I just built this show. But again, it was one of those things where like once I started doing it, like the show, by the end of the summer, the show was. Yeah. Like, and I felt, I felt comfortable starting to pursue school gigs. And so then I started doing that. So then the kids stuff, started being like an anchor gig for me. And that really became cemented in 2009. I had a very frustrating experience in a recording studio where I felt like a little ripped off and that I'd spent too much money. And so I made this decision in the winter of 2008-9 that I was going to teach myself how to record at home. And so I learned some software and I bought some mics, and I, again, with no experience doing it, I spent a lot of time in studios, but never as an engineer. Yeah. But this is like now, like desktop recording is pretty like, you can do it. You can do it in an iMac. Like, you just get Logic or whatever, Pro Tools or something. Yeah. So I learned Logic, and I bought a handful of mics, and I, most of what I was doing was keyboard stuff. So it was all direct in with MIDI. Yeah. And I recorded, I started working on an album on April 15th, it was tax day. And by June 15th, I had a CD in my hand. Like it was 2 months. I just like banged it out and recorded it all in my house, set up drums. And it wasn't my house. It was an apartment, like set up drums in like, I don't know how to mic drums. Like, so around this time, Sirius XM, I think they started a kids channel in 2005, and Bill was on it, and he was like, and I sent him the CD that I made, and he was like, you should send this to them. And so I sent them. I had previously sent them some of my earlier CDs, and they never really bit. But I was like, oh, all right. So I sent them this CD, and they started playing one of the songs on it.
Yeah.
And I was like, holy crap! And national broadcast. And so.
And which CD was this?
This was Homemade Fun.
Yeah.
And the song was Watching All the Cars Go By, which was the very first song I recorded for that album, and it was the first song as an engineer I recorded ever.
There goes a minivan full up with kids. Dad's in the front seat flipping his lid, and I wonder where they're going. Little red sports car, top rolled down. The driver is a circus clown, and I wonder where he's going. Everyone has a place to be. Everyone has a story for me. They just keep coming, and I wonder why. I'm just sitting in the window watching all the cars go by.
So I went to this children's music conference in New York City, and I meet the lady who is basically running the station, Mindy Thomas, who now has this hugely popular podcast called Wow in the World with Guy Raz from NPR. And she's a massive superstar. Mm-hmm. And she still does her show on Kids Place Live. So I met her, and I was sitting at a table with her and Bill's wife, Deb Block, and so we're just talking. They're like, oh, it's so great that you're playing. And Debbie's like, I love that song, and blah, blah, blah. And then Debbie, Bill's wife, goes, yeah, and it's so great now that Sound Exchange exists. And I was like, oh, I don't know what that is. She was like, you know what Sound Exchange is? I was like, no. And I just thought, oh, I'll make some dribs and drabs of royalties from ASCAP for these songs. I didn't expect to make any money on it.
Yeah.
And she was like, oh, you got to find out about Sound Exchange. So do you know what Sound Exchange is? So Sound Exchange is a thing that happened in the early 2000s. Basically, some musicians, some people who were advocates for musicians' rights lobbied in DC, and Sound Exchange became formed. And again, I'm paraphrasing the history of this, but basically in the early 2000s, Sound Exchange formed as an artists' advocacy group that collects royalties for artists, for performance royalties. Mm-hmm. And those royalties, because Sound Exchange is a new thing, and it's not like BMI and ASCAP collect mechanical royalties, they also collect a pile of fees. And they are also these ungainly organizations that have tremendous overhead. Mm-hmm. And Sound Exchange is like, we're looking out for artists, mm-hmm. and we're collecting these performance royalties. So I learned about this, and Debbie's like, you have to sign up because it's like real money. And I was like, oh, what? So Sound Exchange is pretty new still in 2009, and they're just swamped with artists trying to sign up. So there's like a 6-month waiting period. So meanwhile, that song is being played on the radio, but then I start getting royalty checks from them. And whereas like quarterly I was getting, checks from ASCAP, and I was like excited about it, like, wow, I got a check from ASCAP for $150. Holy crap. Mm-hmm. Every quarter, and I was like, I made $600 in royalties. But the Sound Exchange royalties were like, when they were playing that song, it was like a few $100 a month. And I was like, oh. And then they started playing another song from that record. And that song, like, again, I didn't have satellite radio, so I didn't know what was happening. Yeah. They're like, oh, we started playing The Leftovers, which is another song from that CD. Yeah. And it became a hit on that station. And it went to, ran up into their top 10 on this station. And so then, like, I got a royalty check one month for like $1,200. And I was like, what? Like, I never made money like that off my music for, it was making money for me. Yeah. It never happened before. So now I'm like motivated. Like, mm-hmm. So now I put out another record. So now I'm like put out another record at home. And basically, long story short, like, for as long as I can continue to make music and get it played on satellite radio, that means I can continue to make a life as an artist, and it's still not, it's still hand to mouth in its own way. But between that and school shows and teaching improv, you cobble a thing together that is hopefully sustainable.
Yeah. Well, it's great to hear that you've been able to do that for so long.
Yeah. 1988 is when I went on that tour with Big Nazo. So that's 30. How many years is that now? 31 years. Yeah. So that's and there was some really, really lean, difficult times in there. And I still have some parts of the year where it's like get a little scary. But I just try to keep figuring out new ways to work as an artist because I don't know anything else at this point. And I think while I'm sure I could go, do other things, like I have some other cool sort of offshoots. So like I'm like an artist in residence at the Paul Cuffey School, it's a charter school here in Providence, and so that's like a gig that during the school year, like where I work in that school, like once a week ish throughout the year, and play and then create stories and songs with them, and so there are gigs that I get that are offshoots of the kids stuff, that kind of helps sustain it too.
Yeah.
And so now the Superchief Trio, like that band, we play, but like, we're not making a ton of money doing it. It's just supplemental stuff.
And what kind of stuff do you do with Superchief?
So Superchief Trio kind of formed out of the ashes of the Smoking Jacket. So it's very similar. For a long time, we were just a trio, just myself on keys and vocal, and John Cody on drums, and Pam Murray on vocals and trombone. And it was just, I got a gig at this bar in Bristol by myself. It was like I was subbing for somebody who had the gig. Kim Trusty, I think, had the gig, and I subbed for her. And I never played solo shows, certainly only for kids. I'd done solo shows, and I had like I had an hour and a half's worth of material. This was like a bar, and like the guy wanted me to play blues from like 9 to 1, and I was like, so I was just making up songs. I played every song of mine that I knew, and then I was making shit up, and eventually I was like, said to Pam, I was like, you gotta come, I'm dying, like you could come help me, like, and then so then it became me and her and Johnny, and we were still making up songs, and we were playing Smoking Jacket songs, and I had to learn to really like have a heavy left hand because we didn't have a bass player, so I just really became better at like left hand bass, and that band became, was also really deeply rooted in New Orleans music for a really long time. And then I don't know, it was probably early 2000. That band formed in 2000, and a few years later, Tom Ferraro, who was playing with Dave Howard and the High Rollers at the time, and had played with all these other different blues bands. It was a really heavy, very traditional blues guitarist, and really had studied all this stuff and like really knew his stuff. He was like, I see what you guys are trying to do here. I see what this is. And he came and sat in with us once, and then the next thing I knew, like we were a 5-piece band, and it was him that was like, like, don't change the name of the band. I'm like, we're not a trio anymore. He was just like, so what? It's funny. So we just kept the name as a trio, but actually that has served us in a way because we still do some gigs as a trio.
Yeah.
We just, when we do it as a 5-piece now with a bass player and a guitar player, I just refer to us as the largest trio in Rhode Island. Yeah. And it's absurd, but it's, and Tom kind of steered us into doing more swing, and more covers. So we do a lot more cover. Like the Smoking Jackets, when we played, we had like one cover. All the rest of it was like original. And so Superchief carried that on. We started playing some covers with Superchief, a lot of Professor Longhair and Dr. John and James Booker and that kind of stuff. New Orleans, heavily New Orleans. And then Tom came in, and it was like more swing and more like jump. And, he was really a student of this music, so he had a lot of feelings about how stuff should be played. And so when we play with just the three of us, we do, I would say, a more eclectic mix of stuff. We lean more New Orleans and ragtime, and then when we play with the 5-piece, we lean more like swing, and we still do New Orleans, of course, but there's more swing stuff in it with the bigger band. So that's what Superchief does. Is we play a lot of swing dances and places where swing dancers like to go. So that's, I still get my cookies playing that music too, as it were. Yeah.
What would you say is your greatest musical accomplishment?
Wow, that's really hard. It's really hard because of the diversity of stuff that I do. I think, Benny's the Musical is up there just in terms of it really succeeded at what it was trying to do. But for me, I was also like, I'm not a person who was like raised on or was a fan of musical theater. My fiance, Katie, is a huge fan of it. And so sort of before and during and continue, she's kind of hipped me to a lot of the better of that stuff. And I've gone to see a bunch of shows with her. So that was actually incredibly helpful for writing Benny's the Musical. I feel like I wrote some of the best music I've ever written in my life for that show. Just like it's hard, you know, because there's a lot of like music and lyrics, you know, because there's both exposition and emotion in these songs, and they're doing a lot. The songs have to do a lot, you know, so I'm incredibly proud of the music I wrote for that show. And then I'd say, you know, the albums that I recorded, the last few kids albums that I've recorded, I'm really proud of, not specifically because they're getting played on the radio, just because I think the songs are really, they are meaning more to me now that I have a kid, you know, not so much that you know, certainly there's more material that you're getting, but I feel the weight of responsibility of writing them now that I'm a parent. Like, what do I want to say in these songs? And really what it is like, you know, it's just honoring childhood. It's honoring the experiences of kids. And I would say also the reality, the awkward reality of kids and adults having to occupy the same world with completely different agendas, you know, and that's chaos. It's chaos. It's complete chaos. So I'm really proud of the last few kids albums I made. But you know, I'd say like that and Benny's and have been the two big things that I feel like really strongly about, you know, in terms of pride for.
Well, thank you so much, Keith.
Yeah, man.
Appreciate your time.
It was great to talk to you.
That I would find you here this morning. She said that I would see you here today. She said you'd do a dance in your polka dotted pants, and your big red nose would give you all away. Are you the clown? Are you the clown? Are you the clown?